Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? I would like to welcome you to the launch of the book, The 10 Fundamental Questions of Curating. This is a collaboration between the Toussaint, the Art Fund, and Muse Magazine. And this was a project that I initiated about 3 years ago with the help of the Ferrucci Art Trust. It was published in 10 different sections in Muse Magazine over the period of 2 years. And now we have brought this, all these different essays together in one book. There's a foreword also here by myself. And in the original version of these, we invited artists to respond to the essays and work with visuals, and we didn't include those here because of trying to sort of standardize it a little bit, since the visuals were like all quite different from one another. And I'm very happy to welcome Jessica Morgan with me here, and Jessica is one of the authors. She actually wrote the answer to the first question, which is what is a curator? And Jessica and I had the idea that we wanted to talk about some of these questions and then maybe open up to the public and see what your answers to some of those questions are. I was hoping that we would actually have a projection up there, but I don't know, shall I read these questions?
Oh, we can do it one by one. Why
okay.
not?
So I think the first one that we wanted to, well, anyway, why did I want to do this? There was like a whole sort of new wave of publications coming out after a long time where there was basically no literature on curating. And my idea was to go and look at like really sort of fundamental questions in regards to my own profession, also sort of like as a form of reflecting on my own work. And perhaps it also stemmed from like this idea that there was a bit of a confusion about what is curating at this moment, because curating all of a sudden meant so many different things. People were curating in art fairs, people were curating collections, people were curating for fashion houses. All of a sudden, the menu in a restaurant was curated by the chef. And so I just wanted sort of like to cut to the chase and see, okay, what are like these very particular questions, like what is a curator, who is the public, how do we present art, really sort of coming from that point of maybe creating some clarity.
Can I ask, Jens, why do you think there was this explosion in curating? Like, what is it about our current time that led to all of these different manifestations of curating, or perhaps even just the desire for people to use it as a word or a term or an occupation? Do you think there's any kind of answer for that?
Well, I think there have been like different answers to that question, and one of them is something that Dorothea von Hantelmann, the art historian in Germany, once sort of discussed with me, which was the idea that we basically everyone is sort of like curating their own lives now by making all these choices. We're constantly exposed to how to define ourselves, how do we create our own identity, and we're creating this identity by making all these different choices from where we want to live to how we want to eat, how we want to dress, what type of education we want to get. And of course, it's sort of like probably thinking from a very privileged sort of like position, because many people don't have the choice to do that. But
does that then mean that curating is an extension of a consuming culture? I mean, it's the sort of interest in curating is a in a way a reflection of that on a museum or whatever we might call it, on an artistic scale. It's kind of simply a ramification in our realm, let's say.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily if I agree with von Handelmann's idea necessarily, because I don't think that curating is simply only about making selections and choosing things around you or things that you identify with or that you want to identify you. In my case, the exhibition is still like the main primary medium, so I'm working with artworks and with artists in the exhibition space. But that's sort of like, then brings us to a very particular definition of curating, which in my case would be exhibition making. But Maria Lind has spoken about the idea of the curatorial, which means that exhibition making is just one thing that we do as curators, but then there's many different other ways of engaging with the world that could also be understood as curatorial, which maybe is kind of related to also what von Hantelmann was saying.
I have another question, sorry, before we get into the questions of your book, which is, so why do you think there were not so many publications previously? Let's say there was a kind of outpouring from the late 90s on about curating, but for obviously 100 years before that, we've had curators. Perhaps they were, in fact, collectors or people who are their curatorial practice was an extension of ownership. But why do you think there was not a literature of curating previously?
I mean, there were books that maybe relate more to the field of museum studies, and of course also exhibition making or museum studies discussed within the context of art history. What's actually interesting, if you go to Amazon.com and you type in curating, I think you get about like 9,000 hits, where if you go and put in art history, you get about like 350,000. So it's like, but 9,000 I think is still a lot of material, and those are not all books about curating. You know how Amazon works, like wherever that word appears. But I think this whole wave of books that we have seen over the last 5-6 years is sort of almost like the second or third wave of publications on exhibition making, the way we understand it now, this form of like more contemporary exhibition making. One of the first books I ever came across was a book that was Sandy Nan, I think, published at, who else was writing there? Remember, this was called Thinking About Exhibitions, published by Routledge.
Yeah.
That was like maybe 94 or 95.
Which I think came out of his work in the Arts Council, teaching sort of curating. But at that point, they would have called it more museum studies, obviously not a
But for a long time,
yeah.
that was really the only book that I think people were referring to. And that was a collection of essays of previously published text as well.
So I have another question, which is more for you.
But I think just as a
Okay.
You know, we have also seen all these curatorial programs emerge all over the world, and I think that the curatorial programs have offered curators the opportunity to be more self-reflexive, to sort of like begin to develop a theory of curating. So I think this sort of like self-reflexive turn that you've seen in curating is very much tied to these curatorial programs and sort of like a more intellectual academic engagement with curatorial practice.
You could also say there's an economy behind that too. Because, I mean, the education economy behind curatorial programs is massive, and so therefore it needs a literature in order to sort of support it and
that's interesting. I never thought about that. Yeah. But I think, for example, Paul O'Neill is someone who has published quite widely now. I think he has published 3 books on curatorial practice. Maria Lind, and both. Paul is now the director of Bard College, the curatorial program there, and Maria Lind was the one before. And this is interesting that a lot of the literature that I've seen so far is kind of coming together out of a group of maybe 20 people. And so it's a very small circle at the moment that sort of like engages with that, or at least that sort of like dominates the discourse. I think there's other things as well, but they're not really being so put to the forefront.
How would you place this book within the work that you've been doing, both as a curator, but perhaps also publishing or thinking around, sort of writing around exhibitions that say, I mean, you could go back to your book, Should the Next Documenta Be Curated by an Artist, which in a way was already beginning to engage with this question of what's curating, or what's the boundary of curating, what's the relationship between the artist and the curator. How would you see that kind of trajectory in your own work, in a way? Because I see this as very much part of your work.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's a continuation of like just looking at my own practice through another lens. I mean, I think I have done this in my earlier work as a curator, often making exhibitions that sort of investigate the actual nature of making exhibitions and being sort of like self-reflexive about it. Then we started working on The Exhibitionist, which is a journal about exhibition making, and I think the book, 10 Fundamental Questions, is sort of like a little bit of a continuation of that as well. So, Jessica, tell me. What is a curator?
Well, I mean, you know that I actually felt slightly embarrassed when Jens asked me to do this, because I think the 9 other essays in the book are far more serious than mine, and I took a slightly lighthearted, humorous approach to it, which I enjoyed enormously.
Well, that's the reason why I wanted to talk with you and none of the other ones.
But in retrospect, perhaps I feel slightly embarrassed in the context of everybody else is very thoughtful. And
yours is very thoughtful too.
Well, yeah. But I think ultimately what I came to, it was a very nice process to go to, of course, when you're given an assignment like that. It's quite nice being given a framework to think through. And it seemed to me, and I think actually interestingly, many of the other writers come back to this, which is that everything is so context specific. So what is a curator? Well, it depends what type of curator you are. Are you a curator in a museum? Are you a biennial curator? Are you a collection curator? Are you a curator in a historic museum? Are you someone who's trying to direct a museum and be a curator? Where are you curating from? Are you curating from the Western Hemisphere? Are you curating somewhere where you have to really endeavor to create a institution or an audience or the sort of fundamentals in a way of exhibition practice? So I think, in a sense, there can be no one answer, which is, as I said, kind of true for pretty much all the other questions in a sense, in a way of speaking. No?
Well, I don't know if you can say, I mean, it seems like that what you just said, like a lot of those roles overlap. Like in the case of your work, you're working with collections at Tate, you're doing temporary exhibitions at Tate, but you're also curating biennials. You've worked with private collections where you have not collected work for the collections, but you have, like I remember the project that you did with Humex where you collected a show from their collection. So these things often also overlap.
True, although, I suppose the Biennale situation is very new, so I'm not sure I can include that in my roster of activities. But I think what I would say about my own practice, certainly, is that what you've mentioned aside from that are, I'm very much an institutional curator in that rather like the boundaries that you set for me in writing this essay, I like to have boundaries. I love working with collections because you know where they begin and they end, and there's a huge amount that you can do within them. Of course, there's always the kind of contrast between what's there and what's not there in a way, or what you can make more apparent that hasn't necessarily been made apparent. You've got a set of tools to work with, In fact, I find the Biennale situation completely terrifying because you have far fewer, there's not the same rubric. You don't have a limitation in the same way, I think, to have a vocabulary to work with in the way that you have in a museum is fantastic because you can sort of try and remake the language over and over again, but you kind of know what the words are, no? If that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think that's the same thing when you curate a biennial. A certain language and a certain aesthetics and a certain idea has been established of the large-scale international group exhibition, and that's been repeated over and over and over again in most biennials. And how do you, change that, and how do you move on from there? I think that's the question, and I think, we just, maybe many of you went to Venice and saw the Biennale there, and I think with Massimiliano's inclusion of a lot of like more sort of marginal artists, outsider artists, we try to sort of break that vocabulary that maybe has been established.
Yes, although, it's interesting that you bring that up as an example because that felt so much like a museum exhibition to me, in that it was very much put together through existing works and articulated, again, within a sort of found, existing vocabulary again. But I think, I do think there are differences. I think there are very fundamental differences. I think, the fact that, as you were describing, with the kind of group of people who've been largely responsible for the writing on curating, most of them are not museum curators. Latterly, they've become involved with institutions, but most of them are working independently. And I think there's good reasons for that. Partly perhaps one could say that those of us who work in institutions were completely institutionalized, and so we find it very difficult to, step outside and look back at our practice aside from within our own context of a particular museum, perhaps, or a particular activity within that museum, or type of collection curating or exhibition making. But then I think the other perhaps problem with that is that precisely a lot of this writing was produced by people who were not involved in institutions and so therefore didn't have a real insight into the complexities. I would say it was very interesting reading Sophia's piece on collecting, but it's absolutely not the perspective of a larger institution that's been collecting for over 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the differences to what I do were very apparent to me with some of these curators who are not working in an institution.
Well, it's fascinating to see the wide range of what curating has become, from working in a museum, and you work at Tate, which is still a relatively progressive museum. I've started now to work at the Jewish Museum in New York, and there's some curators who have been there for 60 years, and some of them have never worked with a living artist. So it's interesting to me to see how they work. They work on an exhibition for 4 years. I've never done this in my life. Nobody has ever given me the luxury of like working on a show for that long. The projects that I've been working on have always been much faster, and also been used to raising the money myself, and so it's a very interesting situation when you see the different ends of, when you come in as a more creative, independent curator into like a structure that is very set and has been running for a very long time, and how that particular place then operates.
It's also presumably because the Jewish Museum has a collection of artifacts that we wouldn't necessarily, if we want to get into these categories of fine art or use object or design and so forth. I mean, it's a museum that has all of these aspects, which I think is great. I think one of actually the problems that we all face as curators now is the legacy of what happened in the 19th century with the type of specialization that happened of the establishment in London, for instance, of the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is the museum that's devoted towards the decorative arts and also a sort of history of use objects. The British Museum, which has a different type of ethnographic perspective and so forth. But with this kind of divorce almost between these types of materials, I think it also reduced, I would say it limits the potential for what has happened with exhibition making subsequently. And your practice has been very much about bringing together different types of materials.
Why do you think that all these conversations around curating mostly focus curating of contemporary art, or focusing on curating the contemporary, whatever that might mean in terms of contemporary activities, rather than historical exhibitions? You just mentioned the V&A and the British Museum, and those are places that mostly deal with cultural history or history, archaeology. Is there any cultural innovation and curatorial innovation in those places?
Well, I'd be rather cynical about it, and I'd say that actually I think it is partly due to the commercial aspect of the curatorial courses that are now run everywhere. There is definitely there's a fit between the production of one type of even if it's an academic material, but it's still a material with an economic foundation behind it, and the curatorial courses that exist in order to ratify and justify this type of material. I think the interesting thing would be precisely if we could open up a lot more, which I think it's something that should happen a lot more in publications, but also in terms of our working practice and working with different types of curators. I think this sort of bizarre separation, particularly with this sort of invented point in the 1960s where everything afterwards is apparently some other realm, which I think curatorial courses have very much ratified in a way, the idea that exhibition making didn't exist before that. And it's very problematic. So maybe it's also a problem of these curatorial courses that really tend to begin with a very limited vocabulary of what an exhibition is, and not think about, well, we could go back hundreds of years if we want to.
Yeah, I think that the 60s sort of like, in particular, have a very strong effect on curatorial practice in terms of like actually being the last moment when all of those aspects of the art world, the museum, the market, the art object itself, all of this was radically questioned in that particular moment. And I think that is sort of like something that is attractive, particularly when you're a young student who goes into this field, and that's sort of like a connection. I've seen this with a lot of artists also, that this particular era was a very particular point of engagement.
Yeah, although I think the 19th century witnessed a very close proximity between the market and the role of galleries, the role of the economy Paris was in fact, most of the galleries were on the street that was also the street of the fashion houses. It was absolutely what we witness today. We have Louis Vuitton, we have the galleries, we have the people who are making the money in hedge funds, which they were also in the 19th century. I think it's a matter of actually just opening up your perspective a little bit more. We've decided that the 60s was this moment, but actually I'm sure that we could, if we dug a bit deeper, we could find a lot more. It's the same as, I think, having the limited purview that we have in terms of geography, It's been so many years before curators and academics and the art world has really woken up to the existence of something beyond the US and Europe. I think the same needs to happen in terms of a historical perspective.
Well, I don't know if you can compare that. I mean, the opening up of the art world, sort of like having a more global perspective, has also to do with a much easier access to other places, to telecommunication, being able to travel cheaply,
True.
Which you maybe not have. I'm currently working on an exhibition at the Jewish Museum, which is called Other Primary Structures, which is based on a show that took place at the Jewish Museum in 1966, Primary Structures, that was curated by Kinister McShine, which was the first exhibition of minimal art. And there were no artists included outside of the US or the UK, just simply because it was not common to travel for research. I think Harald Seemann, when he did When Attitudes Become Form, did like 4 research trips, one to Italy, one to the East Coast, one to the West Coast, and one to England, and that was all he actually really did.
Although, of course, there were quite a few Latin American artists in New York at that time. But let's move on.
Yeah.
You asked me question number 1.
What is the curator? Did you answer that?
I'm not sure I did, but I'm going to
Did
ask you.
you answer that? Okay, so you haven't answered it.
We can come back to it afterwards.
All right.
What is the public?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. What is the public? I've been working in several different institutions, and each time I think we had a completely different audience there. And the moment when the audience that I had to, collaborate with, work with, engage with was when I was at the Waters Institute in San Francisco, which is a contemporary art space that is part of an arts college. So at that point, it was very clear to me what my audience was. It was like 90% of the people who came to see our shows were students from the college, or maybe students from some of the other universities or colleges. But it was very clear that the program we did had to address the needs and desires of young artists. And often these younger students came and said, well, we would really like to have this and this artist come and give a talk, and I know that you work with him. And it was almost like a jukebox. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm happy to bring Mario Garcia Torres or Abraham Cruz Villegas over, because there was really a desire on the side of the students to have this over. So now I'm working at the Jewish Museum, which has traditionally an older audience. I think our membership, average age of our membership is like about 63. And 90% of them are Jewish from the greater New York area. And now our mandate is, how do we open this up? How do we get beyond that particular sort of constituency and spread our wings further? So, of course, we're thinking about different types of programs. We have done now a show with a retrospective of Jack Goldstein. We did a Sharon Lockhart exhibition before, and I can see immediately on the audience figures that those shows are not as accepted as when we do the more classic program that we have done so far. So, bringing an institution into a transition like this is extremely interesting, but it is actually very much tied to how do you educate your audience, how do you, mediate the works that you show in the galleries. And I haven't thought about this so much since I moved into this institution, and I'm thinking about even bringing in a curator specially just for the mediation of the exhibitions, to think very clearly about, okay, what is our general audience, and how do they engage with our exhibitions? And it's interesting because we have so many members, we constantly get feedback through our membership director. So yeah, it goes from like very simple things that there are not enough benches or that the wall text is too small to like, larger questions of like, okay, why is that here in this museum? Why do you do a Jack Goldstein retrospective? Is it just because he was Jewish, or is there other connections to this? And it helps to get that sort of feedback.
But do you, is your ambition then about, the classic question is always about increasing the public, right? It's numbers. How high are the numbers? How high can they be? Or is it more about, are you more concerned about who those people are? Or is it simply that you want to bring your current membership into thinking about?
I think that's the first step. I think when you go within a museum that has had somewhat of an established identity, and you somehow want to change this identity, you want to, open it up, you want to, clean the dust away. It's very difficult because there's only that much time that you're given. So when you see like our audience attendance drop by 20% since we have Jack Goldstein open, then the alarm bells ring at the shop, at the cafe, because all of those things are related to the numbers of audiences. And then we see that, and then income is down, and we can only hope that the board is saying, okay, we understand we're in a transition. Let's see how we generate new audiences.
But to play devil's advocate, should you be changing like that? Should the Jewish Museum be heading in a contemporary direction, or should it in fact be working within the realm that it's worked in, with more historic and more sort of clearly, let's say, programmed exhibitions that deal with the trajectory of the history of the museum thus far? Well, why do you feel that's necessary?
It's a very specific question that I could go into like a lot of detail, but it's so specific to the Jewish Museum and its history and what has happened there so far. We were brought in with the idea by the board, and that's Claudia Gould, who's the new director, and myself as the deputy director, to really bring it into the 21st century. We just had a board meeting where we were discussing, someone was saying, why do we need a bigger website? can't we use that money to buy artwork? And I was saying, well, yeah, we need to buy artwork, but we also need to invest, this money into creating an online platform that is, 21st century, because we're like stuck somewhere else.
How was Primary Structures received? Is it that your audience has grown old, that they were the same audience that came to Primary Structures and now they've grown older and they're no longer engaged with contemporary practice?
Well, Primary Structures is probably the most iconic exhibition that the museum did, and it's 50 years ago. So, and we still live from that history. Everybody always says, oh,
but
yeah,
at the time, was it
that's
popular?
such a great history. Well, it changed a lot because every director brought in a new idea. And at that time, Alan Solomon was the director, and there was barely any connection to the Jewish experience or to Jewish history. I understand that really much more like the way that the Whitney Museum understands of being an American museum or being a museum of American art. It touches upon it here and there and here, but it's not necessarily something that has to happen all the time. So the previous regime at the museum, if you kind of call it that, was very much into the idea of everything had to have a Jewish relation. And that was, after Alan Solomon, who didn't work on that level ever. So it's just, I think, for us thinking about opening it up again, making it relevant for wider audiences. So that's sort of a few ideas around the public. So let's talk about collecting. Why do you think it's still important to collect? Can you still collect?
I mean,
for museums.
Actually, it's something that fills me with anxiety. I work a lot on the collection at Tate, and someone I used to work with, I actually can see her smiling, she probably knows what I'm going to say. I actually find it very upsetting, this idea that we're buying all this stuff. It's like, oh my God, enough with it, It's what's happening to it. I mean, it's terrifying.
Where does it go?
Of course, actually, I must say that we're quite good at putting it on display. Some museums are not. We have, I think, at any time, close to 60% of the collection of Tate is on view, not necessarily at Tate or Tate Modern or Tate Britain, but we have a network of museums that we work with around the country, so it's very well used. But still, this idea of the kind of endlessness of accumulation, I mean, there's me and then there's countless people who will be there after me also buying things, and all the other people who work there who buy things. I mean, slightly breathtaking. I always have this image in my mind of like a heap of art somewhere, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But I think it is a problem. I think that the other side to that is perhaps the one that none of us are really confronting are the sort of conservation and display issues around collecting now. Because so often we're collecting things, and I'm jumping into a very specific example here, but I think it's really quite at the crux in a way of this problem of the accumulation of materials is, how do we preserve them? Do we preserve them? Not all of them were intended to be preserved, the lengths to which we go to preserve things that were never even imagined to be preserved in this way. And then how do we display them when they've actually also created or achieved this kind of status or being or even like physical presence that was nothing like the original physical presence that they had? I mean, one example could be something as well known as Eva Hess, with material that's now so discolored and distorted and distressed. It looks nothing like the work that she made, and she's not around to tell us that this is not her work anymore, but I wonder if she would actually say that. And I think, this is really a problem that none of us had really thought about when, of course, we were dealing with marble sculptures and oil on canvas and materials that were essentially quite static in terms of they may get dirty, they may get damaged, but they don't have quite the same material issues that we deal with now with contemporary art. And that's something that bothers me enormously. On top of that is the fact that, certainly somewhere like Tate, where we have luckily this incredible audience, 5-6 million people a year, but the result of that is that we have to show things in such a way that quite often they look nothing like, well, the installation is nothing remotely like the way that they were shown when they were originally shown by the artist in a particular context or conceived by the artist, because they have to be protected and barriered and so forth. So I think the question of whether we're doing the right thing with the material that we're collecting is a big question in my mind, and how you resolve that.
Well, what interested me about this question is also really why collect, and can you still collect? And if the idea of collecting the way museums collect isn't in fact like an outdated idea that maybe doesn't really longer is in tune with the production of art. I mean, it really goes back to this idea that, of building a canon of art, of formulating a narrative of art history. And I don't know if it does longer really possible in terms of how art is progressing or how the development of art is going, and also with the amount of art that is produced. And as you said, and I don't mean this as a sort of value judgment, but maybe sometimes a work can also just exist for a short period of time and doesn't need to be collected, and we can see it at a museum and a gallery for a temporary exhibition, and then the piece can disappear again. It's just how far again can you go also with this, with the whole collection practice? And
I mean, I think we
you
will
ultimately become, I mean, this is the idea of the museum, being a repository, being an archive of art where you collect the things that you deem valuable to outline a certain progression.
Yeah. And we're of course, and I feel certainly a much safer ground when I'm dealing with historic, for us, relatively historic material, whether I tend not to work on the collection prior to, let's say, the 1950s, but at least there you feel certainly that you're dealing with, at this point, a lot of what we do is about, in fact, trying to question what's been collected so far and come up with a new narrative. It's very much about expanding the parameters internationally of the collection or globally. But I think once we reach the last decade or so, the questions begin to arise, also because of the extreme proliferation of the material that we're talking about. It's incomparable in terms of amount. I mean,
Well, you already spoke about the globalization of the art world, and Tate has done a really good job in opening up and bringing in a lot of art from other parts of the world other than North America and Western Europe, as it was done for a very long time. But you have also been very, criticized for that as a sort of neo-colonist approach to making a collection, especially Tate, where has specific curators for specific locations. It's almost sort of like a battle plan of how to sort of take over the world. And remember you once showing me this map, and the world was divided into 5 different zones, and the collectors were responsible for these 5 different zones. And I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Do these places, should they have the works that is produced there, or don't they have the facilities to maintain the works? Because you were talking about the preservation, so perhaps it's just a complicated question. And that maybe brings us to our last question, which is, what about responsibility, curatorial responsibility, and what could that mean in terms of the display of works?
That's for me again. It's
no,
your
we
turn.
can both answer that.
Yeah,
but I think we have a different relationship to that. I think.
Yeah, tell me your idea of it, because I'm not quite sure.
Well, you mentioned before a project that I did many years ago, which was the next documentary should be curated by an artist. And I think that particular project came out of a conversation that I had with the German artist Carsten Höller, who went to see Documenta 11, which was organized by Okwi and Weather, and felt that most of the art was sort of utilized to illustrate a particular argument that the curator wanted to make. And he said, what would be interesting would be if an artist could organize Documenta, because he felt that there would be a different form of engagement with the work, and perhaps it wouldn't sort of illustrate the visions or ideas of the curator so much. That's really where the book came from. Ironically, of course, the book was then done by a curator, which sort of maybe gave a whole twist to that particular idea again. Yeah. But I like what you said about the display of works and how to find, present the work in the way that it maybe was intended by the artist. And there was, of course, this wonderful essay by Daniel Buren about the sort of compromise that you have to engage with as an artist as soon as you take a work out of the studio. And Buren's response was that he never made any work in the studio anymore. He only makes site-specific things because he couldn't, there was no way of negotiating this compromise for him.
Yeah. Yeah, I find this question of responsibility complicated, the sort of ethics of curating, because it just seems so vast in a way. I mean, it touches on almost every aspect of what we do. Who do we buy things from? How do we maintain them? How do we show them? How do we treat our public? How is the public relating to the work? In a way, it's sort of every single question that you've laid out here, no?
Well, for me, it's always interesting to create a context in which a work of art can be presented and seen. And maybe in this particular context that I create, the work of art takes on a different meaning than in the context that you might create. I don't necessarily think this is a problem. But I noticed that many other curators seem to be very particular about it and wanted it to be as close to the intentions of the artist. So then, of course, the idea of the white cube is born. Like what is the most neutral environment to show art that has little impact, contextual impact on the piece itself, and it's a complicated question. But perhaps you should open up to the audience and have a couple of questions from there, if there are any. Please.
Thanks. I'm just interested in Jessica's comments about the responsibility the responsibilities of the collection and of collecting, and what seemed to be your kind of critical attitude to the museum's responsibility to being an archive. Because it seems to me that it points to a kind of confusion that seems to be in curating now, which is that curating is very active and is very responsible for producing the contemporary, rather than the older model, which is that you might have a public or museum space which looks at what's going on outside of it, maybe tries to represent it in some way, but essentially is in a relationship where the production of the contemporary and of contemporary art is outside of the institution. So it seems to be very, it's funny that curators don't talk very much about their own coming into being as professionals, because before 1970, even in big museums of modern art, the production of exhibitions, curated exhibitions, is actually subcontracted to artists and to critics. And the idea of the curator as this very active individual, it was completely absent. So I guess my question is there do you think that there is a problem in the fact that public institutions and large institutions that employ curators in this active sense are in danger of taking too large a role in producing, or actually, having the role of producing what contemporary art is at any given moment?
But there I make a distinction between producing exhibitions and collecting for the collection, because that has always been, the origin of curator, caretaking of objects and deciding which objects come into the museum, which objects don't come into the museum. That's always been the historic role that you're describing. So in a sense, actually there was a very active role of curators, but it was not, it certainly wasn't discussed, it wasn't public, and it wasn't made apparent, which I think is, perhaps one of the, it's back to this sort of fallacy of the idea of all these things just washed up in some way, and not looking at exactly who chose them and why it was only these things and not the others. It's very authored. Every museum collection is very authored, quite often literally back to one particular private collector who initiated the process, as is the case at Tate or pretty much any other major museum. I think exhibition making and collection activity are still two very different activities, and I feel that very much working in the museum. The work that we do on the collection is constant and every day, and it's very research based, and it may actually result after 3 years in one object, and then it might take another 3 years until that thing is actually in the collection officially, because of the very complicated process of acquisitioning. So I think that maybe it's back to the first question, what is a curator? There is still this type of activity in museums, and that's why I say I think our activity is very different to a lot of the independent curators who aren't involved in this type. It's almost like a sedimentary process, by the time the object's in the collection, or whatever it may be, there's been years and years of sort of unraveling until it's got there, and even then afterwards, there's sort of a whole process beyond that. But maybe I'm not answering your question.
Just to quickly clarify the question point a bit further, it's also true that quite apart from the responsibility of the collection, big institutions are becoming much more active in the capacity to present incidental, contemporary shows, or the exhibition of contemporary work which is not part of their collection. Tate is very, very now active in expanding its capacity to present. So I guess my question is really, has the public institution changed to such an extent that it's no longer so much about a preservation, an archival function, as in effect a production function of contemporary presentation? Because there's been a lot, there has been since the 90s big debates about whether institutions should hold collections.
Yes.
And a big emphasis on the idea of them as sites of production. Now, is there any kind of problem there?
It's funny, I don't know, speaking from the sort of interior, so to speak, in fact, actually, the exhibition program, whereas the collecting aspect of our activity feels so embedded in the institution in a way, the exhibition program, simply because of its ephemerality and quite often, particularly at Tate, where some exhibitions may be compensating for the lack in the collection. For instance, of most of the early part of the 20th century, many of the exhibitions we've organized have been really responding to the fact that we don't have a collection that represents this aspect of art history. So the way that we present that to a public in order to be responsible about presenting a history of art, let's say, is precisely to organize exhibitions that deal with these areas. But quite often we're bringing in outside expertise there as well. It's not even an in-house activity. When I think of the colleagues at Tate that I work with, I think of them as very much in relation to their expertise in particular areas, in relation to the collection. I mean, actually, it only occurs to me now when you ask me this question, but when I think about the group of curators at Tate, and I think we probably think of each other very much in that way. We have, as Jens described, for better or worse, we have our areas of specialized focus, but it doesn't mean that activity is ongoing. That's the difference. If you do an exhibition, it comes and it goes. I may spend 3 years working with John Baldassare on his exhibition, and we remain in contact, but basically that moment of working with Baldassare is gone, whereas the ongoing research that you do on the collection is every day, every week, every year, and for years and years and years to come. And you're very aware of its legacy because those things are things that you're dealing with afterwards because questions arise about their caretaking or their display and so forth. Whereas the exhibition is very momentary. So I'm not sure that we have actually shifted gears. If anything, because of the weight of responsibility of the collection, I think we are even more aware of what that involves. And precisely because of the shift that we've tried to place on in terms of what we're doing with the collection, I suppose, or how we're developing the collection.
I think what this idea of the museum as a producer or the institution as a producer goes to also, and specifically when you think about Tate, is that you have a turbine hall. This is a unique format that never existed before. No artist would have thought about making work for a turbine hall that didn't exist. So in a certain way, the museum, the institution, the curator directs the way art is made or seen. When you think about, this is a really beautiful example. Alfred Barr went to a big trip to Russia, and he met Rodchenko, and Rodchenko was already working on all his photographs and stopped painting, and Barr wanted to have paintings because it would illustrate his sort of idea of art history and the avant-garde. So he was sort of trying to find painting in order to paint this picture. And now what we see a lot is how curators approach art and say, well, can you do something with performance, for example? When you think about Performa, this festival in New York, where Rosalie Goldberg asked visual artists to make performance, artists who have maybe never thought about this before. Maybe they enjoy it, maybe it's something interesting for them, but you can really see how curators or institutions really shift also the way artists think, the practice is developed, and things are moving.
I think there was a
One more question, I think, and then we're running out of time. Wait a second, there's a microphone coming.
Yeah, thank you. I always wanted to ask curators, or especially Jessica, you're working at Tate Modern, in terms of collection and curating. I've got a personal interest in new technology and this idea about collecting digitized works, because you talked, I just heard a little bit about, it takes several years for a particular work to go into the acquisition and the process. Most of us from outside may think it's very quickly done, but it's a long process.
Yeah.
I'm aware of a couple of things from my own personal experience at a couple of regional museums in England have bought my work. But the idea about new technology, because the works are infinite, okay, you have limited edition of video works, but there are people working in new technology, digital works, which are infinite in a sense. So the actual work, and vis-a-vis the notion of museums and the idea of collections of objects, of course it's a file. It's a file, in a sense it could be a digitized file in artwork. So I'm kind of interested in this area because it's kind of a blurred, it's in a sense it's a contradiction in terms of collection as well, because it's not a one single work. An artist can create an edition of digitized works, I'm sure, but where does it end? Where does it start? So that's one thing that I'm interested in, how kind of museums are dealing with this idea, because in a sense, Jens, you talked about how curators they push certain themes or certain formats like performance, and artists kind of navigate. But artists have always kind of navigated their lives and their work, before this curating kind of from what is Kunsthalle, which is part of the Venice Biennale, Harold Semen's concept, that he became the new curator, like post-war in a sense. The curator became somebody significant. Historically, from my understanding, limited understanding, curators were in museums, they were just getting on with their work, logging, information about artworks, etc. So anyway, fast forward the situation, what I was talking earlier, how does museums deal with new technology and the notion of collection?
I think, the one example that you've used there would be the only one where I think it really challenges the collection, although I think it doesn't really, because, we would face the same issue with, which is a question that really goes back to the heart of what we collect and why we collect it, which is about its originality, let's say. So limitless prints, for instance, also raise huge questions for the museum. Do we collect posters? Do we collect uneditioned work? Do we collect anonymous work? We have one, I think two web works in the collection, which of course have been kind of artificially limited in their editioning, you could say. But then, to a certain extent, everything is artificially limited as an edition if it's a endlessly reproducible material. I mean, any photograph could have been the same, any video, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure that it's so different with digitized works, and it sort of, in a way, comes back to the same questions about market forces and whether artists decide to limit the work or not. I think, one of the questions I would have is why, at a certain point we lost, back to the 60s and 70s, but there were works that were produced in limitless editions, but we never see that anymore. I think, the museum probably would be more open to collecting these works now, but actually they rarely exist. Yeah.
Well, you have good ears. Okay, I think we're coming to an end. Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that this book is available at the Moose stand next door, and feel free to have a look, and if you like it, I'm sure we'll all be happy that you purchase one. Thank you very much, Jessica. Thanks to the
Thank you
Ferrucci
all.
Art Trust, Moose Publishing, Art Basel.